The morning Jennie Sutton pulled a bullet out of Sheriff Dale Marsh's shoulder with nothing but a pair of iron tongs, a bottle of whiskey, and hands steadier than the frontier wind. He rode away without so much as a thank you, and she stood in the doorway of her small adobe clinic watching the dust swallow him whole, thinking that this was simply how it had always been. Colton Flats, New Mexico Territory, 1878. A town that had sprung up along the Pecos River like most towns did, desperate and loud and sure of itself, convinced that permanence was just around the corner if enough men with enough money said so loudly enough. The Santa Fe Railroad had been snaking its way through the territory, and Colton Flats sat close enough to the proposed line that speculators had flooded in, buying up land and building saloons before they bothered building anything resembling civilization. What they had not bothered building, not in any serious way, was a proper medical practice. What they had instead was Jennie Sutton. She was 26 years old that autumn. Not old by any measure, but in the territory, years had a way of settling on a person's bones heavier than they did elsewhere. She had come to Colton Flats 4 years prior, following her father, a well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective doctor named Harold Sutton, who had believed that the frontier needed healing more than the East did. He had been right about that. He had been wrong about his own constitution surviving it. Harold had died of cholera in the spring of 1876, barely 2 years into their Western life, leaving Jennie with a modest collection of medical texts, a small adobe building on the edge of town that served as both clinic and home, and a knowledge of medicine that exceeded his own because she had studied twice as hard and paid twice as much attention. She had no formal degree. Women did not easily obtain formal medical degrees in 1878, though a handful had managed it, and Jennie had followed their stories in whatever newspapers reached Colton Flats with the sharp hunger of someone who recognizes a mirror image of their own ambition in the lives of strangers. But absence of a degree had not kept her from doing the work. The people of Colton Flats had come to her sometimes reluctantly, sometimes desperately, and she had treated them. Broken bones, infected wounds, difficult childbirths, snake bites, fever, consumption, lead poisoning from old mining work, the peculiar injuries that came from living close to horses and cattle and men who drank too much. She had handled all of it. The 4 counties were Colton, Ridgway, San Marco, and what the locals still sometimes called Bajo County, though its official designation had changed twice. In all 4 of them, word had spread the way word always spreads in sparse country, slowly, stubbornly, and with a permanence that official channels could never achieve. If you were hurt bad enough or sick enough or scared enough, someone would eventually say, "Go to Jennie Sutton. She will fix you if anyone can." And she would fix them, and they would leave. That was the particular character of her loneliness. It was not the loneliness of someone ignored or invisible. She was seen constantly. She was needed constantly. Men came to her door at 2 in the morning with bleeding fingers and laboring wives and sick children. She never turned anyone away. She kept her lamp burning late and her supply cabinet as stocked as the nearest trading post would allow, which was never as stocked as she needed. So she supplemented with what she could grow in the dry strip of garden behind her clinic: lavender for calm, yarrow for wounds, various barks and roots she had learned from a Navajo woman named Silverthorn, who had passed through the territory 2 years back and stayed long enough to share knowledge that no medical text contained. But when they were healed, when the fever broke, when the wound closed, when the baby cried its first cry, they went back to their lives with a relief so complete it apparently left no room for acknowledgement. It was not cruelty exactly. It was something more like the way people treat the sun. They do not thank it for rising. They simply wake and expect the light. Jennie had grown up enough not to expect gratitude, but she had not grown so hard that its absence stopped stinging entirely. She was still human enough for that. The particular October morning when Thomas Carson rode into Colton Flats, Jennie was in the middle of an argument with Horace Guthrie, the owner of the general store, about the price of carbolic acid. "Horace," she said, standing at his counter with the particular patience of a woman who has had this exact conversation 17 times, "I use it to clean wounds. Without it, those wounds become infected, and then I have to amputate, and then you have one-armed miners who cannot work your claim, and you lose money. The carbolic acid is, in a very direct sense, an investment in your own prosperity." Horace Guthrie was a round man with impressive side whiskers and the deeply stubborn conviction that women talking about money were somehow asking for something they did not deserve. "Miss Sutton," he said, with the slow, deliberate patience of someone talking to a child, "the price of carbolic acid has gone up. That is not my fault. If you need it cheaper, perhaps you ought to order it somewhere else. The next trading post that carries it is 60 miles south," she said. "Then perhaps 60 miles south is where you ought to go," he said, and smiled like he had been clever. Jennie opened her mouth to respond. She had a very good response prepared, one involving specific mention of whose wife she had helped through a complicated labor last February, when the front door of the general store swung open and a boy named P.D. Marsh, one of the sheriff's many nephews, came in so fast he nearly knocked over a display of canned goods. "Miss Sutton," P.D. said, breathing hard, "there's a man just come in on the South Road. He's bad hurt. His horse brought him in, I think, because he was barely sitting upright." Jennie set down the bottle of carbolic acid she had been holding, noted with satisfaction that Horace reflexively grabbed it to keep it from breaking, which meant he valued it quite a lot, and followed the boy outside. The South Road came into Colton Flats past the livery and the church, both of which were buildings of roughly equal moral significance to most of the town's residents, and it was near the livery that a crowd had gathered in that way small-town crowds gather, all simultaneous concern and undisguised curiosity. A horse stood in the middle of the road, still saddled, head low, sides heaving, and slumped forward over the animal's neck was a man. Jennie pushed through the gathering people with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the only person in a crowd with actual purpose. He was tall, she could tell that even slumped over, dark-haired, maybe late 20s, wearing the kind of trail clothes that had seen genuine hard use, not the theatrical frontier costume that land speculators sometimes affected, but actual worn leather and canvas that had been repaired in multiple places by someone who knew what they were doing. His right arm hung at an angle that told her clearly the shoulder was dislocated, or worse. His shirt along the left side was dark with dried blood from a wound she could not yet assess. His face, what she could see of it turned half into the horse's mane, was pale under several days of dark stubble. "All right," she said clearly, and the crowd gave her space because it always did when she used that particular voice. "I need two of you to help me get him down. Carefully, please, because that shoulder is wrong. Somebody take the horse." It took considerable care, and the assistance of Denny Pratt and old Caleb Moore, both of whom were strong enough to be useful and sensible enough to follow instruction, to get the man down from the horse without making whatever was wrong with his shoulder worse. When they laid him on the ground and Jennie could get a proper look at him, she found not just the shoulder and the side wound, but a gash across his left hand that was showing early signs of infection, and a bruising pattern across his ribs consistent with a kick from a horse or a hard fall. "He needs to go to my clinic," she said. "Denny, Caleb, can you manage him between you?" They could and did. Jennie walked ahead to open doors and clear her examination table, moving quickly and without any of the inner anxiety she sometimes felt when a case was genuinely serious. The anxiety was there, it always was, a low hum beneath everything, but it did not reach her hands. Her hands were always steady. She had the fire built up and her instruments laid out by the time they brought him through the door. He was still conscious, which surprised her. Men with that many things wrong with them tended toward unconsciousness as the body's most reasonable response. But his eyes were open dark brown, she noticed, the particular deep brown of river clay, and they tracked her face as she bent over him, which was a good sign for his head. "Can you hear me?" she asked. Yes. His voice was rougher than she expected, not thin with pain but genuinely rough, like a man accustomed to going long periods without speaking. What happened? A pause. His jaw tightened. Horse spooked off a ledge edge. I went down the side of a wash. How long ago? Yesterday morning. She kept her expression professional and did not let the alarm show. He had ridden at least several hours into Colton Flats with a dislocated shoulder, broken or severely bruised ribs, and an infected hand wound. The amount of sheer stubborn endurance that required was considerable. Your shoulder is out of its socket, she told him, because she believed patients deserved accurate information. I need to put it back. It is going to hurt quite a lot. I want you to breathe through it and try not to move suddenly, because sudden movement from you is very likely to result in injury to both of us, and I cannot afford that. Something moved through his expression. She thought it might be amusement, which struck her as an interesting response to what she had just described. Fair enough, he said. I'm Jennie Sutton. I'm a healer. Another pause. Thomas Carson. Are you passing through or staying? Hadn't decided yet, he said, and then she set his shoulder, and whatever conversation was left got swallowed by the gritted silence of a man being very deliberate about not making noise. She appreciated that, actually. The ones who screamed were harder on her nerves, not because she was unsympathetic, but because she needed to hear what was happening in her own clinic. The shoulder went back in cleanly. She had done it enough times to know when it seated right. She felt him exhale a long, controlled release of breath and said, There, that's done. The rest is easier. She cleaned and stitched the side wound, which turned out to be from where he had caught a projecting rock on the way down the wash, deep enough to need closure but not deep enough to have hit anything vital. She cleaned the hand wound with the carbolic acid she had left at Horace's store and therefore did not currently have, substituting with whiskey, which was less effective but not negligible. She bound his ribs. Throughout all of it, Thomas Carson was the most cooperative patient she had seen in months. He followed her instructions when she gave them, held still when she needed him still, turned when she needed him to turn, and at no point suggested that he knew better than she did how to manage his own injuries, which distinguished him from approximately 2/3 of the men she treated. She had him settled on her cot in the back room, the room she kept for patients who needed watching overnight by early afternoon, with a small fire keeping the space warm and her best blanket over him because he had been wet through from a creek he had crossed that morning, and she was concerned about chill fever developing on top of everything else. You should sleep, she said, standing in the doorway between the two rooms. Miss Sutton. Yes. Thank you, he said, simply and directly, with none of the performing awkwardness that men sometimes applied to gratitude when it was offered to a woman. She stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. It was such a small thing. Such a simple, ordinary thing to say. She had heard it before, certainly, from patients over the years, but something in the directness of it, the evenness of it, landed differently. She became aware that her throat had tightened slightly, which was embarrassing, and she covered it by saying in her most practical voice, Sleep will help the healing more than anything I can give you, and went back to her main room before the quality of her expression could betray her. She sat at her small desk and stared at her own hands for a long moment. Then she opened her patient journal and began recording Thomas Carson's injuries with her usual precise handwriting. And if her pen paused for slightly longer than usual before writing his name, she counted that as nobody's business but her own. He slept through the afternoon, and through the night, and into the following morning, which was exactly what she had hoped for because sleep was genuinely the body's most efficient healer. She checked on him twice, found his color improved and his breathing even, and went about her other work. 3 patients came to her door that evening. A ranch hand with a finger smashed by a wagon wheel, a child with a rash that turned out to be from contact with a desert plant, and a woman from the boarding house with a persistent cough that Jennie prescribed rest and steam for, knowing the woman would not take the rest but would probably manage the steam. In the morning, she heard movement from the back room and found Thomas Carson sitting upright on the cot, examining the bandaging on his hand with a careful, intelligent attention. "Good morning," she said, bringing in a tin of water and the hard biscuits that constituted most of her own breakfast, because she had not had time to cook anything more substantial. She added a small pot of the honey she kept for medicinal use, because the sugar would be good for him. "Good morning," he said. His color was considerably better. The pallor was gone, and what replaced it was a face she could now properly see angular, weathered, with a directness in his expression that reminded her of terrain. Not handsome in any theatrical sense, but compelling in the way that things shaped by actual experience were compelling. A face that had been places and remembered them. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Better than yesterday," he said. "Worse than I'd like." "That's about right," she said. "Your ribs will take several weeks. The shoulder will ache for a while, but you have full range of motion if you're gentle with it. The hand needs watching. There was infection starting, and I want to make sure it doesn't take hold." "Which means I shouldn't ride out today," he said. "Not for several days at minimum," she said. "You can get a room at the boarding house on Garrett Street. Mrs. Plunkett runs it. She's decent and not expensive. Or you can stay here if you'd rather not be moved unnecessarily. I have the space." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I don't want to be in your way." "You won't be," she said. "I've had patients stay before. There's no imposition in it." She set the biscuits and honey down on the small crate she used as a bedside table and moved to check the wound on his side. "Besides, I want to see that hand each day for a week. If you're staying in town anyway, it's more practical." "All right," he said. "Then I'll stay if it's truly no trouble." She cleaned and redressed the hand with fresh linen, noting with satisfaction that the redness had not spread since yesterday's cleaning. "You said you hadn't decided whether you were passing through or staying," she said, not looking up from the wound. "What brought you to this part of the territory?" A pause, not evasive exactly, but thoughtful. "Looking for land," he said. "I've been working cattle drives out of Texas for 6 years. I've saved enough to think about a place of my own. Someone told me the Pecos Valley had good grazing land at reasonable prices." "That's true enough," she said. "Though the reasonable prices part depends on how early you move given the railroad speculation. Are you from Texas originally?" "Missouri," he said. "A long time ago." She finished with the bandage and stood. "Well, Colton Flats has land around it worth considering. I can't tell you more than that because land and cattle aren't what I know. But if you want to ask questions, Denny Pratt knows the surrounding range well. He's been here since the town was founded." "I appreciate it," Thomas said. Then, after a brief pause, "How long have you been here?" She found herself answering more easily than she usually did. Most people in Colton Flats had known her long enough not to need the story, and strangers who passed through either didn't think to ask or asked with the particular condescending curiosity that required her to justify herself, as though her presence in the territory was an aberration. Thomas Carson asked it the way a person asks about the weather, with genuine interest and without an agenda. She told him about her father, about coming west, about the clinic that had become hers by default and then by choice. She told him about the medical texts she read by lamplight and the knowledge she had gathered from every source available, formal and informal. She did not tell him about the loneliness, because she was not in the habit of telling strangers things that made her feel exposed. But she talked more than she usually did, and when she stopped she felt slightly surprised at herself. "You like it," he said, not a question. "I like the work," she said carefully. "I like being useful. The territory can be difficult in other ways." He nodded, and there was a quality to his nod that suggested he understood the thing she had not said, without pressing her to say it, and she found that quality extremely disarming. Over the following 3 days, Thomas Carson stayed. He was not a man who could be still for very long. She could see it in the way he held himself, always slightly forward-leaning even at rest, a man whose body was accustomed to motion. But he respected the limitations she laid out with a discipline that impressed her. He walked slowly around the clinic's small yard in the mornings when the sun was warm, which she told him was good for him. He sat on her front step in the afternoons when the weather permitted. He read, producing from his saddlebag a worn copy of a collected Shakespeare that surprised her enough that she said something about it, and he smiled in a way that changed his whole face. "My mother left it to me," he said. "She was very determined that her children would read something other than cattle prices." "Was she successful?" "With me," he said. "My brother Dale refused. He went into law enforcement instead, which my mother considered roughly equivalent to not reading." Jennie laughed, and then was slightly startled by the sound of her own laughter, which she heard so infrequently in her daily life that it came out a little rusty. Thomas looked at her with an expression that was warm and careful at once, and she looked away toward the middle distance and composed herself. She began, without entirely intending to, telling him things during those afternoon conversations that she did not normally tell people. Small things, mostly. Her opinion of the territory's plant life. The particular satisfaction of a difficult diagnosis correctly made. The book she was trying to finish ordering, a newer medical text on antiseptic technique that had been written by a physician in Edinburgh, and which she had been attempting to obtain through a bookseller in Santa Fe for 6 months with mixed results. He listened in the way that some rare people listen, not waiting for a pause to insert themselves, but actually attending. He asked questions that suggested he had heard what she said and thought about it. He told her things, too, about the drives up from Texas, about the landscape of the staked plains, about the work of cattle ranching in a way that was honest about both its hardships and its genuine appeal to a man who needed space and motion. On the 4th day she removed the bandage from his hand to check it and found the infection fully cleared, the wound closing cleanly. "That's what I wanted to see," she said, and she was aware that she said it with a warmth that was not entirely professional and did not try to correct it. "You're very good at this," he said. He was watching her hands. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "More than practice," he said. "You have an instinct for it, the way you move around a patient, the way you think. I watched you yesterday when that woman came in with the child, the one with the fever. You knew what was wrong in 2 minutes. You could see it in how you stood." She looked up at him because that level of observation from someone she had known for days was startling. "You were paying quite a lot of attention," she said. "I was," he said simply, and met her eyes without flinching. She set down the clean linen she had been folding and sat in the chair across from where he sat on the cot. Outside, the afternoon wind was making its usual commentary through the gap under the clinic door. She considered him seriously. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "Why are you paying attention?" He took a breath, long and even, the kind of breath a careful man takes before saying something true. "Because," he said, "I have been in a fair number of towns in the past 6 years, and I have met a good number of people, and you are the most interesting person I have met in all of that time, and I would like to keep paying attention if you'll allow it." The clinic was quiet for a long moment. Through the adobe wall she could hear faint sounds from the street, a wagon, someone's voice, the general murmur of a small town's afternoon. Inside it was warm and still, and she was sitting 3 feet from a man who had just said with complete composure that she was interesting to him, and she was examining her own response to this and finding it considerably more significant than she had expected. "I have not had a great deal of practice receiving that kind of attention," she said, honestly. "I know," he said, equally honest. "I can tell, and I'm not in a hurry." She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, not agreeing to anything in particular, simply acknowledging that they had both said real things and that this was noted. She went back to folding the linen. But she was aware with a distinct clarity that something had shifted in the room, and the shift was not unwelcome. 2 more days passed. Thomas was well enough by the end of the first week to move to Mrs. Plunkett's boarding house, which he did on a Thursday morning, settling the question of payment to Jennie for her services by leaving on her examination table an amount that was considerably more than she charged, weighted down with a note that said only, "For the Edinburgh medical text, which I suspect has been too long in coming." She stood over it for a long time, and the tightness in her throat returned, and this time she did not try to explain it away. He came by the clinic each morning as she had instructed, for her to check the hand. These visits were brief by medical necessity. The wound was healing well, and there was progressively less for her to do, but they had developed a quality beyond the clinical. They talked about everything and nothing, about the land he had ridden out to look at east of town, which he described with a careful enthusiasm that told her he had already half decided on it, about the political situation in the territory, which was complicated and ongoing, about the railroad and what it would mean, about books, about medicine, about the sky in different seasons. On the 8th morning she declared his hand healed sufficiently to require no further daily checks, and there was a brief silence in which they both understood that the official pretext for the visits was gone. "I would still like to come by," he said, "if that's acceptable." "It's acceptable," she said. He smiled, and she smiled back without trying to moderate it, and that was approximately the moment that Jennie Sutton admitted to herself, with the same directness she brought to medical diagnosis, that she was well on her way to being in love with Thomas Carson. The admission was somewhat inconvenient because she had a great deal of work to do. October was tipping into November, and the weather was changing in the way of desert country, not gradually but decisively, cold settling in over the course of a few days with a thoroughness that felt permanent. Cold weather brought respiratory sickness, and this year was worse than usual. A camp of workers living in poor conditions east of town, men brought in to do survey and grade work for the railroad, had developed a fever that was spreading through their tents, and Jennie had been going out there every other day with what medicine she could spare, which was never enough. It was on one of these trips, a gray November morning with the wind carrying serious intent, that she came back to find Thomas Carson sitting on her front step, not in his usual state of comfortable waiting, but with the coiled quality of someone who had been concerning himself. "You went out to the railroad camp again," he said, standing as she approached. "Yes," she said, dismounting from her small brown horse and beginning to unstrap her medical bag. "3 new cases today. I'm worried about transmission to the town proper. 2 of those men came in to buy supplies last week." "Let me take that," he said, meaning the bag, which was heavy with depleted supplies. She let him take it. "The carbolic acid situation is now genuinely critical," she said, going inside, speaking half to herself. "I have to write to Santa Fe today. There's no way around Horace Guthrie's price if I need it immediately, but—" "Horace Guthrie," Thomas said, setting the bag down carefully on her examination table, "is a man who responds very well to negotiation that doesn't come from a woman, which is its own kind of injustice, but it is the reality of the situation right now." She looked at him sharply. "I don't need someone to advocate for me with Horace Guthrie." "No," Thomas said, "you need carbolic acid, and if I can help you get it at a price that doesn't strain your supplies, then the person who benefits is not my pride, it's the sick men in that camp." He met her eyes steadily. "Let me come with you to the store. I'm not going to speak over you, but 2 buyers are sometimes better than 1, and Horace strikes me as a man who responds to other men's money more readily than he should." She considered this. It was practical. It was also, she recognized, Thomas demonstrating the particular skill of a person who understood the difference between useful support and patronizing interference. "All right," she said. "But if you try to speak for me rather than with me, I will make it known." "Understood," he said. They went to the store together that afternoon. What happened was that Jennie conducted her negotiation exactly as she always did, and Thomas, standing slightly to the side with his hands in his pockets, said at the critical moment when Horace Guthrie began his familiar condescension, "I'm considering purchasing a significant quantity of supplies as I'm looking to settle in the area, and I'll need a reliable general store for that, Horace. Your willingness to work fairly with Miss Sutton, who by my observation keeps half this town healthy, is relevant to that decision." He said it conversationally, without pressure, and went back to looking at the shelf of tools next to him. Horace Guthrie agreed to the original price Jennie had asked for. Outside, she turned to Thomas on the boardwalk and studied his face. "That was neatly done," she said. "You had already done the work," he said. "I just reminded him of the stakes." "You did it well," she said. "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." The look he gave her then was one she thought about later, in the lamplight after her last patient of the evening had gone. It was a look of simple, unguarded pleasure, the particular expression of someone receiving something they had not thought to ask for but were genuinely glad of. November deepened. The fever at the railroad camp was brought under control through her sustained effort, supplemented, she noted with measured gratitude, by the fact that Thomas Carson, who had apparently introduced himself to the camp foreman, had quietly organized 3 other men in town to donate several blankets and additional firewood to the camp, which addressed the fundamental living conditions contributing to the spread of disease. He mentioned this to her not as a report but in passing, the way you mentioned the weather, and she realized that he was not expecting credit for it any more than she expected credit for her own work, which was a quality she found unexpectedly moving. She had a conversation with Mrs. Plunkett, her boarding-house neighbor, in which that woman, a forthright woman of 50-some years with no patience for subtlety, said directly, "That Carson man asks about you every morning before he even asks for his coffee," and then waited, clearly expecting a response. "He's a patient," Jennie said. "He was a patient," Mrs. Plunkett said. "His hand was healed clean 3 weeks ago, and he's still here, looking at land he's looked at twice already and finding reasons to walk past your clinic." She tilted her head. "He's a decent man, Jennie. I've run this boarding house for 9 years, and I know the difference between decent and pretending." Jennie thanked her and left, and walked home through the cold November street, and stood in her clinic looking at the small fire she kept burning against the chill, and thought about decency and what it looked like close-up versus at a distance, and what she, who had spent 4 years surrounded by people and essentially alone in any significant way, thought about the prospect of not being alone. The thing about Jennie Sutton was that she had very little practice with the idea that someone might choose her specifically, rather than what she could provide. People came to her for what she could do. They came because their body was failing them and she could fix it. They did not, in general, come to her kitchen and sit by her fire and ask her what she thought about things because they wanted to know what she thought. Thomas Carson did both. He had developed a habit, one she could not quite bring herself to discourage, of appearing at her door in the evenings after her last patient, usually with something practical. Once a bag of coffee because he had noticed hers was running low, once a length of fresh oilcloth for her examination table because the old one was cracked, once, memorably, a small jar of the particular honey she used for wound treatment that he had tracked down from a ranch wife south of town after Jennie mentioned she was running short. He never arrived empty-handed, and he never pretended that the point of his arrival was the thing he carried, and Jennie, who was a precise thinker, understood exactly what the real point was. She began to look forward to the evenings. The first time he stayed long enough that the fire had burned low, and they had lost track of the time entirely. They were in the middle of a conversation about whether the territorial governor had any genuine interest in improving infrastructure, or was simply extracting political capital from the appearance of it. And Jennie had gotten properly animated about the subject in a way she rarely allowed herself in public because opinionated women in 1878 tended to be seen as difficult rather than engaged, and she was mid-sentence when she noticed that Thomas was watching her with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated delight that she lost her words entirely. "What?" she said. "You are magnificent when you're angry at politicians," he said. "I'm not angry," she said. "I'm informed." "Those two things are not mutually exclusive," he said. "I know. You've just made the most convincing case I've heard all year for territorial infrastructure reform, and you made it while poking a dying fire with a stick, and it was the best thing I've witnessed since arriving in this territory." She looked at him for a moment. The fire was very low. The clinic was quiet and warm in the particular dense way of adobe walls that have held a day's heat. Outside, the wind had settled. "Thomas," she said. "Jennie," he said, and the evenness with which he said her name, just her name with no particular drama, settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for weeks. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have been working towards something since you arrived here." "I have," he said. "I think I would like to know what it is." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her directly in the way she had come to understand was simply how he was, a man who looked at things straight. "I came into this town half dead on a horse," he said, "and you put me back together, and since then I have been finding out who you are, and everything I find out makes me want to know more. I like you, Jennie. I admire you. I think you are the sharpest and the most capable and the most honestly good person I have met in my entire life, and I would very much like to court you if you're willing, and if you're not, I will find a way to live with that and continue being a reasonable neighbor, but I wanted you to know the honest state of things." The fire crackled once, settling. "The honest state of things," she said, and found she had to look down at her hands for a moment because looking at his face right now required more composure than she currently had. "I think the honest state of things is that I am not accustomed to being known, and you have been working quite persistently at knowing me, and it is both the most welcome and the most frightening thing that has happened to me in a very long time." "Which feeling is bigger?" he asked quietly. She looked up. "Welcome," she said. "It's welcome that's bigger." He breathed slowly. The careful tension that had been in his shoulders released. "Then may I court you?" He asked, and there was such earnest gravity in it, such real asking, that she felt something warm and large move through her chest. "Yes," she said, "you may." The Courtship of Jennie Sutton by Thomas Carson proceeded in a way that was entirely consistent with both their characters, which is to say, it was practical and genuine and full of conversation, and not at all dramatic in its external expression. But internally, for Jennie, it was among the most significant things that had ever happened to her. He bought the land east of town in late November. 40 acres along a tributary of the Pecos, good grass, a natural windbreak of cottonwoods along the north edge. He showed it to her on a Sunday afternoon when she had no patience and the day was cold but bright, riding out to it on their 2 horses, hers the small brown she called Pepper, his the recovered bay who had carried him half dead into town. They stood in the cottonwoods and looked across the flat, gold-brown grass of late autumn, and Thomas told her what he planned for it, not a grand scheme but a sensible one, cattle grazing, eventually a proper house, building it incrementally as the money allowed. "You could have gone anywhere in the territory," she said. "I know," he said. He was looking at the land, but she was fairly certain his attention was also on her. "You decided to settle here," she said. He turned and looked at her directly. "Yes," he said, "I did." The November wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, which still clung amber and rust to the branches, and she was suddenly, absolutely aware of him standing next to her, the warmth of him, the solidity, the clean wool smell of his coat against the cold. She was also aware, with the precision that characterized most of her thinking, that she wanted to close the small distance between them considerably, and was examining whether this was a reasonable thing to act on. "Jennie," he said. "Yes." "May I hold your hand?" She looked at his outstretched hand, gloved against the cold. She looked at his face, which was open and patient and earnest in equal measure. Then she put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it with a careful firmness, and they stood in the cottonwoods looking out at his land, and the cold wind came and went, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing that was missing. This specific warmth. They rode home in the late afternoon, and at her clinic door he helped her down from Pepper with a steady hand and then kept hold of it for a moment. And she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and he said, "I'll come by tomorrow evening if that's all right." and she said, "It's all right." And he smiled, and she smiled, and she went inside and stood against the closed door for a long moment, feeling things she had carefully not let herself feel for a very long time, and they were entirely pleasant. December came, cold and clean. Thomas had begun the first stages of his ranch, a temporary shelter structure first, to use as a base of operations, while he built more substantial structures in the spring. He was often out there during the days, and Jennie was occupied with the winter's medical demands, and they came together in the evenings with the shared pleasure of two people who have spent a day doing real work and find themselves genuinely glad of each other at the end of it. He gave her, for Christmas celebrated modestly in the territory, a small gathering at the church and a general sense of goodwill struggling against the more habitual frontier pragmatism, the Edinburgh medical text she had been trying to obtain for 6 months. He had found a route to it through a bookseller in Albuquerque, and the book arrived wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string, and when she opened it and understood what it was she had to sit down, which she was not prepared for. How? She said, "Letters," he said. "It took 3 intermediaries, but it exists and you should have it." She held it for a long moment, this book she had wanted, that contained knowledge that could help people. Then she looked at him and said, "You are entirely impossible," which was the warmest thing she knew how to say, and he understood it as such. She kissed him on the cheek that evening for the first time, brief and warm and deliberate, and felt him go very still in the way of a man carefully registering something important. Then he turned and looked at her, and everything in his face was very quiet and very clear, and he said, "Jennie," in that level voice that made her name sound like something worth saying, and she said, "I am falling in love with you, Thomas," with the directness of a woman who respects accuracy above almost all other virtues, and he said, "I fell in love with you when you told me the carbolic acid was an investment in Horace Guthrie's prosperity." And she laughed, really laughed, the genuine unguarded kind. And he caught her hands and held them and looked at her like she was something he had been traveling a very long time to find. The first real kiss came 3 days later, on the evening of the 28th of December, 1878, in the doorway of her clinic with snow, rare in this part of the territory but not unprecedented, coming in dry and light drifting past in the lamplight. She had been telling him about a difficult case that day, a man from the railroad camp who had developed pneumonia and was in serious condition, and the conversation had shifted from practical to something quieter, and she had paused in the middle of a sentence, and he had been looking at her and the lamplight and the snow, and then they had simply arrived at each other the way water arrives at the lowest point, not dramatically, but inevitably. The kiss was slow and warm and careful, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back with a certainty that surprised her, and when it ended she stayed close to him for a moment and felt his arms close gently around her and thought, 4 years. 4 years of being needed and being alone, and here is this man who came in barely alive on his horse and has been paying attention ever since. "I love you," he said quietly against her hair. "I love you," she said back, with exactly the same directness. Outside, the snow fell softly on Colton Flats, and the town went about its evening business entirely unaware of the fact that Jennie Sutton, for the first time in the memory of anyone who knew her, was not alone. January of 1879 brought hard cold and hard work in roughly equal measure. The railroad camp pneumonia case that had been worrying her resolved, to her profound relief, in recovery rather than death. The man, a young Irishman named Michael Connolly, was 23 years old and healthy enough that his body could fight if given proper support, and she had given him the best support her resources allowed. When he recovered, he was the kind of grateful that she had almost stopped expecting, specific and sincere, visiting her clinic one morning with a hand-carved wooden box he had made during his convalescence, and pressing it into her hands, saying that he had never met a woman who worked as hard or cared as much, and he was going to write to his mother in County Cork and tell her about Miss Jennie Sutton, who had saved his life. She set the box on her desk and placed her instruments in it, and every time she opened it afterward she thought about what it meant to be seen, and about Thomas Carson, and about the particular education this winter had given her in the geography of her own heart. Thomas was building. Not the grand structure yet, but the bones of it, fence posts going in along the boundary of the 40 acres, the shelter upgraded to something more permanent, negotiations with a neighboring ranch about grazing rights. He was methodical and unhurried about it, and watching him work on it. She had ridden out twice to see the progress, and both times he had walked her around the boundary with a specific attention that she recognized as wanting her to see it clearly, to understand what he was building and to imagine herself in it. She felt something clarify. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon in February, the 16th, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them and winter light flat and bright through her small window. He had been quiet in a particular way, the way he was sometimes when he was working up to something, and she had been watching him and waiting with a patience she had not entirely known she possessed. "Jennie," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it right, so I've been thinking about how." "How are you getting on with that?" she asked, a brief, warm smile. "I think I'm ready." He put down his coffee cup. "I know that you have this clinic," he said, "and I know that this work is as essential to you as breathing, and I know that your place in this town is your own, built by you, earned by you. I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm asking something more specific." She was very still. "I'm building a house on that land," he said. "It'll be a proper house by summer, big enough for a family. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Jennie. I want to be your family and for you to be mine. I want to wake up next to you and hear you talk about medicine at the breakfast table, and ride out to the clinic with you in the morning and come home with you at night." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "I would like very much for you to marry me if you're willing." The February light was quiet and white. She looked at their hands, his surrounding hers, steady and warm. She thought about the past 4 months, the evening conversations, the land in the cottonwoods, the Edinburgh text in its brown paper wrapping, the kiss in the doorway and the snow. She thought about what he had just said, not asking her to give anything up, asking to stand beside it. "Yes," she said, "I am willing, I am very willing, Thomas." He squeezed her hand and exhaled in a long release that told her, even after everything, he had been genuinely uncertain, had genuinely feared the answer, and the vulnerability of this capable, steady man who was still afraid she might say no, reached her in a place she had not known was reachable. She came around the table and he stood and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heart, and it was entirely sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was, she thought, exactly what the word home was supposed to mean. They were married in April, the 8th, in the small church on the south end of Colton Flats. It was not an elaborate wedding. Neither of them was given to elaborateness. But it was well attended, because nearly everyone in town had at some point been healed by Jennie Sutton. And when the word spread that she was marrying the man who had come in half-dead last October and bought the land east of town, there was a general feeling of appropriate rightness about it, expressed in the New Mexico Territory manner of men nodding and women bringing food. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and fitted and handsome, and she had borrowed a small veil from Mrs. Plunkett, which she wore without much conviction but which made Mrs. Plunkett emotional in a way that was clearly important to her. Thomas wore a suit that he had apparently procured in Albuquerque specifically for the occasion, charcoal gray and properly fitted, and when she walked up the aisle of the small church and saw him standing there looking at her with that particular expression, the one she had first noticed in her clinic, the one that was warm and careful and completely without pretense, she felt the full accumulated weight of the past 6 months land on her at once. And it was not heavy in the bad way, but in the way of something real. The ceremony was performed by the minister, Reverend Harlow, who was a decent man of earnest faith, and when he asked if they took each other, they both said yes with the quiet conviction of people stating an established fact rather than making a declaration. Michael Connolly, now recovered and back at work on the railroad but still in the area, had carved them a small wooden plaque as a wedding gift, which read in careful, uneven letters, "To the best healer in 4 counties, and the man who was smart enough to know it." She had to excuse herself for a moment when she read it, stepping out to the church's backyard with the cold spring air for company, and Thomas followed and found her not crying but close to it, and he stood with her in the spring afternoon and held her hand and said nothing, because he always knew when nothing was right, and she was grateful for that. She kept her clinic. This had never truly been in question. Thomas had made it explicit from the beginning, and their life together was constructed around both the ranch and the clinic as twin necessities. He rode with her in the mornings, helped where he could with the practical side, the heavy lifting, the supply transportation, occasional intimidation of Horace Guthrie, which proved reliably effective, and went on to the ranch. And in the evenings they came home to the new house, which was finished by June. A solid adobe and timber structure set at the edge of the ranch land with windows that faced east to catch the morning light, which Jennie had specifically requested because she liked to see the sun come up. The house was the most beautiful thing she had owned. Not because it was grand, it was not. It was practical and well-built and honest, like Thomas himself, but because she had been consulted on every aspect of it. He had asked her opinions on the kitchen design with the specific earnestness of a man who understood that the kitchen mattered, and she had told him what she needed: a large work surface, good ventilation, space for her medicinal herbs to dry, and these things were incorporated without argument or negotiation because he simply valued her assessment. Summer on the Pecos in 1879 was hot and dry. The cattle prospered. Thomas had acquired 20 head to start, a conservative number, and they were doing well on the grazing land along the tributary. He worked long days and came home in the evenings sunburned and satisfied, and they ate dinner together on the porch when the heat of the day had passed, and these were among the finest hours of Jennie's life. She was also busier than ever medically, because summer brought its own category of problems. Snake season, scorpion season, the particular hazards of men doing heavy outdoor work in serious heat. She treated a boy who had been bitten by a diamondback and spent 2 frightening days managing the venom's effects, and he survived, and the boy's father, a stoic rancher named Garrett who had never previously said 2 words to her beyond the clinical, looked at her after with his son breathing steadily on her cot and said, "I don't know how you do it," with a sincerity that stripped all his usual taciturnity away. "Neither do I sometimes," she admitted, and he nodded like that was the honest answer. She told Thomas about that in the evening. They were on the porch with the last light leaving the sky in long copper stripes. "He meant it," Thomas said. "I know he did," she said. That's what made it strange. I'm not accustomed to being told I'm doing something extraordinary. I know what I do is important because I see the results, but having someone else say it, it matters, Thomas said. Being seen matters. She leaned against him, and his arm came around her, and the copper light faded and the stars came out over the Pecos Valley in their outrageous quantity. "You were the first," she said quietly. "You thanked me the first night. I've thought about that more than you probably know." "I remember the night," he said. "I'm not sure you understand what it meant," she said. 4 years of putting people back together and watching them ride away. And you, broken in several ways in my back room, said thank you with such simple directness, and something inside me just—" She stopped, searching for the word. "Unlocked," he offered. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, "that's it exactly." He tightened his arm around her. The night was full of insect sound and the distant movement of cattle and the soft voice of the river. "You deserved every thanks you never got," he said. "I can't give those back to you, but I can keep giving you mine." She pressed her face against his shoulder and held on, and he held her back, and it was the Pecos Valley in the summer of 1879, and they were 2 people who had found each other in the strange, contingent way of the frontier and built something real, and she was grateful for it in every part of herself. In August she told him she was pregnant. He received this news in the way he received most news of significance, with absolute stillness for a moment, and then a smile that started slow and built into something that changed his whole face. He stood in their kitchen in the morning light and looked at her with that smile and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" Which was, she thought, entirely characteristic of him. His first response to significant news was to inquire after her well-being. "I am well," she said. "Tired, which is expected, otherwise well." He crossed the kitchen and took her hands and held them carefully. "A child," he said with a quality in his voice that was pure wonder, and she thought, "This is the man I married. This steady, wondering man. Probably arriving in spring," she said, "which is a good time for it. The worst of the winter work will be done and it'll be before the summer heat." "You're already planning the logistics," he said. "Someone has to," she said. He laughed and she laughed, and he kissed her with great care and said, "I love you, Jennie Carson," and she said, "I love you, Thomas." And the morning light was warm on the kitchen floor, and the child they were making together was already, without question, wanted. She continued working through the pregnancy, which her own medical knowledge told her was appropriate given that she was young and healthy, and the pregnancy was progressing normally, and which several women in town seemed to feel was inadvisable, perhaps hoping that Jennie Sutton becoming a mother would finally moderate her more inconvenient habits of independence. It did not. She treated patients until 2 weeks before the estimated date, at which point she handed off the most acute cases to a young man named Dr. Peter Wells, who had recently arrived in Colton Flats with an actual medical degree from a proper school in the East, and who had the good sense to recognize that Jennie knew considerably more than he did about treating the specific population of the territory, and asked her questions accordingly. Their relationship with Dr. Wells was one of the things she had not anticipated. A peer, finally, in her own town, someone who spoke medicine as a first language. He was 24, earnest, slightly overwhelmed by the reality of frontier practice versus what he had learned in school, and she found herself becoming a kind of mentor to him with a naturalness that surprised her. He was grateful for it in the uncomplicated way of the genuinely humble, and she enjoyed it more than she expected. The baby came on the 12th of March, 1880, in the house with the east-facing windows, which filled the bedroom with a pale early light during the long night of labor, and it was a boy red-faced, furious, enormous-lunged, exactly as healthy as she had planned for him to be, and Thomas, who had been present throughout because she had absolutely refused to be confined alone to a bedroom, while the man she loved sat uselessly in the other room, held his son with the expression of someone who has just had the whole meaning of the word future become concrete. They named him Harold Thomas Carson, Harold for her father and Thomas for his own, and he was from his first hour an emphatic and opinionated presence, qualities that both his parents recognized from their respective mirrors with a resigned affection. Harold's arrival changed the texture of their life, but not its essential character. Jennie returned to the clinic within 6 weeks, which shocked some and surprised no one who actually knew her. She arranged her hours around feeding times, and Thomas adjusted the ranch schedule to be home midday, and Mrs. Plunkett, who had become something close to an aunt in the fabric of their life, took Harold on the mornings when neither parent could manage it. It was not always smooth and it was not always easy, but it worked. And it worked because both of them treated it as a shared problem requiring practical solutions rather than a conflict of priorities. Harold grew. The ranch grew. The clinic continued. These 3 things proceeded simultaneously through the years following with the organic complexity of real life, not cleanly or without trouble, but with sustained forward motion. There was trouble, of course. The territory was not a peaceful place in any settled sense. There were difficult years when the cattle prices dropped, and the work outpaced the income, and Thomas came home tight-jawed with the weight of it. There were times when Jennie lost patience, 2 childbirths that broke her in different ways, an old rancher named Chester Briggs who came in too late with something that had been growing in him too long, and a young woman from the railroad settlement who died of a fever that a better supplied clinic might have treated more effectively, and whose death Jennie carried for a long time in a particular private way. Thomas was present for these losses. Not with platitudes, but with presence, sitting with her in the evenings when she needed to be quiet, talking through the medical facts with her when she needed that, simply holding her when she needed that. She was, correspondingly, present for his hard times. The drought year of 1881, when the creek dropped and the grazing land went to dust and they lost 8 cattle. The complicated negotiation with a neighboring landowner who challenged the eastern boundary of the 40 acres and required a year of legal back and forth that drained money and energy and culminated in Thomas winning, but only through persistence and significant expense. She sat with him through those nights the way he sat with hers, and this was, she thought, what love was in practice. Not the constant warmth of the beginning, though that remained and deepened, but the specific presence of a person through the actual terrain of a life. Dr. Wells established himself in Colton Flats as a permanent fixture, and eventually married a schoolteacher named Clara Banks, who arrived to start the town's first proper school in the autumn of 1880, and was a woman of sharp intelligence and considerable organizational capacity. And she and Jennie became friends in the way of two women who recognize each other across a room as speaking the same language. This friendship was one of the unexpected gifts of Jennie's life. Genuine female friendship had been scarce in her years of solitary practice. And having Clara for dinner on Thursday evenings, the four of them around the kitchen table with Harold asleep in the back room, talking about the town and the territory and the future, felt like a kind of abundance. They had a daughter in the spring of 1883, April, green-eyed and quieter than Harold from the beginning, who turned out to have her mother's hands, a quality Jennie noticed before Harold was 6 months old, those long, precise fingers. They named her Alice, after Thomas's mother. With 2 children and a full practice and a working ranch, their life was dense with activity but not overwhelmed by it. Thomas had hired 2 ranch hands, by this point good men, a quiet Tejano named Raphael and a younger man from Arkansas named Sam, and the operation had expanded to 60 head on expanded leased grazing land. The ranch was genuinely viable. The house had been added to, a room built for Harold and one in planning for Alice, and a proper surgery space attached to the clinic that Thomas had organized and constructed with the same methodical care he brought to everything, consulting Jennie on every specification. The surgery addition meant she could manage more serious cases without sending patients to Santa Fe, which was the nearest hospital in any real sense. This mattered enormously to the people of the 4 counties, who in many cases could not afford or survive the journey. She handled things in that surgery that technically exceeded what was expected of a frontier healer. The combination of her accumulated experience, the Edinburgh text and others that had followed it, and a clinical mind that did not stop learning. And if there were still physicians in the territory who raised eyebrows at the scope of her practice, they tended to do it at a distance rather than to her face. Because the results of her work were visible in the people walking around healthy in Colton Flats and its surroundings. Dr. Wells said to her once, in the surgery after a complicated case they had managed together, "You know, Jennie, in 10 years there will be medical schools that admit women routinely. And when there are, I hope you'll tell your daughter that was partly possible because of women like you who did the work without waiting for permission." She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "You're going to make me cry, Peter, and I have 2 more patients." And he had laughed, and they had gone back to work. She was thinking about that conversation one evening. It was the autumn of 1884, October. The cottonwood leaves in the same amber rust they had been the afternoon. Thomas showed her the land 6 years earlier, sitting on the porch with Thomas, while the children were inside with Raphael's wife Maria, who helped in the evenings, and whose presence had become indispensable. The cooling air was full of the particular smell of autumn grass and far-off wood smoke, and Harold, who was 4 years old now, came to the door every 5 minutes to report something of world-changing importance before being redirected inside by Maria. "I've been thinking," Jennie said. "Tell me," Thomas said. "About the practice, about what I wanted to become." He turned to look at her in the way he always did when she was thinking something significant. "I want to train people," she said. "Not just treat patients. I want to teach. There are young women in this territory who have the instinct for it. I've seen them in the families I've worked with, the ones who pay attention and ask the right questions. If I can teach them, if I can give them what I had to piece together from books and experience and other people's knowledge, but give it to them more deliberately, then there are more healers in the territory," he said. "Better served communities," she said. "The 4 counties having someone who can help. Dr. Wells has talked about supporting it. He has connections at the medical school in Santa Fe that opened last year. He thinks they might be persuaded to grant credentials to students trained under a combination program." "You would be formally recognized," Thomas said. "That's not the main point," she said. "No," he said, "but it's a good point anyway," she smiled. "It would require more space, a proper teaching room, more supplies, investment." How much? She had numbers. She had always had numbers. She told him, and he listened with the focused attention he always brought to the ranch's planning, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, working through it with the methodical mind she had come to rely on. "We can manage it," he said. "Not immediately, but by next spring we can have the money set aside if we defer the east fence expansion." "I don't want to defer the fence expansion," she said. "You need it." "I want it," he said. "I need you to teach." She looked at him. The lamp through the window laid a warm stripe across his face. 6 years of mornings and evenings, 2 children, 1,000 conversations in this particular light. "Thomas," she said. "Jennie," he said. "I love you quite unreasonably," she said. He reached across and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in the familiar way of long habit. "The feeling is entirely mutual," he said, "and the teaching program is happening." It did happen. By the spring of 1885, the teaching space was built off the clinic's south side, a clean whitewashed room with a demonstration table and shelving for the texts and supplies. 3 students enrolled in the first term, 2 women and a young man, all from the surrounding county, all with the quality of close attention that Jennie had learned to identify. She stood at the front of her new teaching room on the first morning and looked at them and felt something move through her that was different from anything else. Not the satisfaction of a fixed wound or a broken fever, but the particular satisfaction of something being extended, multiplied, carried forward. She taught them everything. Not just the practical techniques, but the thinking behind them. How to observe. How to ask a patient the right question. How to respect what a body is telling you. How to distinguish between what the textbook says and what the actual patient in front of you is demonstrating. She taught them about the plants that Silverthorne had taught her, which had no place in any medical text but worked reliably in ways she could document. She taught them the difference between what a healer could and could not do, which she considered as important as the techniques themselves. Thomas came to the clinic to pick her up on the evening after the first teaching session and found her at her desk with the particular expression she had after working on something she cared about deeply, slightly flushed, eyes bright, still in the middle of thoughts that the end of the day had not resolved. "How was it?" he asked. "Perfect," she said. "Oh, Thomas, they ask the right questions." All 3 of them. Young Mary Garrett, Chester Garrett's daughter. "You remember Chester, she asked me today why we don't see more cases of the infection type I described in the railroad camp pneumonia, which is exactly the right question, which means she's thinking about patterns and not just cases." "Chester Garrett's daughter," he said with a small smile. "The man who told you he didn't know how you did it. His daughter is going to learn how," Jennie said. "And then she's going to go back to that ranching community in Ridgway County and do it there." Thomas sat across from her at the desk. "So there will be a Jennie Sutton in Ridgway County," he said. "A better trained one," she said. "One who won't have to figure it all out alone." He reached across the desk and touched her face, brief and gentle. "You figured it out," he said. "Everything you had to piece together alone, you figured it all out, and it was right, and people are alive because of it. That matters, Jennie. It will always matter." She covered his hand with hers. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it does. I just want it to be easier for the next one." "That," he said, "is exactly who you are." The years that followed were good years, full years. Harold grew into a tall, serious boy who wanted to know how everything worked, mechanical things, natural things, the logic of the world, and showed an early inclination toward the ranch that gave Thomas a particular quiet joy. Alice grew into a girl of great precision and warmth who, by the time she was 3, could be found sitting in the corner of Jennie's clinic watching patients being treated with the focused attention of someone already taking notes. And Jennie's heart had a specific response to this that she did not try to articulate but simply allowed to be what it was. The teaching program expanded. 3 students became 6, became 12 over successive terms, some staying locally, others carrying their training to other parts of the territory as Jennie had intended. The connection with the medical school in Santa Fe strengthened through Dr. Wells's advocacy and the increasingly difficult-to-ignore evidence of the quality of Jennie's program graduates. In the spring of 1887, she was formally recognized by the Territorial Medical Board. Not a full license. The structures were still not quite there for that, but an official acknowledgement of her program and her practice that constituted, in the language of 1887 New Mexico Territory, as close to a credential as was available to her. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a morning in May, Thomas across from her with his coffee, the children not yet up. She read it twice, set it down. "Well," he said, watching her. She looked up at him. "They've recognized the program," she said, "and my practice, formally." He set down his coffee cup. His smile came slow and genuine and complete. "Jennie," he said, "it's not everything," she said. "There should be more. There will be more eventually. It's inadequate representation of what the work actually—" "Jennie," he said more firmly, "take the moment." She stopped. She looked at him. She looked at the letter. She thought about a 22-year-old woman arriving in the territory with her father and a bag of medical texts, and a 4-year stretch of putting people together alone, and an October morning 6 years and more ago, when a half-dead man on a horse had come in off the South Road and said thank you in the dark of her clinic and something had unlocked. "All right," she said. "I'm taking it." She picked up the letter and held it and let herself feel the full weight of the recognition, which was significant, and then set it down and reached across the table and took Thomas's hand, which was more significant still. "I want to do something," she said. "Name it," he said. "I want to go out to the land," she said. "To the cottonwoods, the 4 of us, today if the clinic can spare me." "The clinic can spare you," he said. "Dr. Wells is covering mornings this week anyway." "Then let's go today," she said. "Get the children up, pack something to eat." "Yes," he said simply. They rode out that morning. All 4 of them, Harold at 8 years old, managing his own horse with the careful competence of a rancher's son. Alice at 4 years riding in front of Thomas on his bay, which was an older and placider horse now, but still the same one who had carried him in off the South Road that October long ago. The May morning was warm and clear, the sort of day that New Mexico Territory produced occasionally like an apology for the harder seasons, and the cottonwoods along the tributary were in their spring brightness, leaves new green and flickering. They ate in the shade of the trees, and Harold found a lizard of enormous personal importance, and Alice sat in Jennie's lap and pointed at clouds with the seriousness of someone conducting an inventory. The river moved past nearby with its low murmur. Thomas sat against a cottonwood trunk, long legs stretched, hat tipped against the sun, watching his family with an expression of such unguarded contentment that Jennie, looking at him, felt the accumulated weight of everything they had built settle over her with a completeness that left no room for incompleteness. She thought, This is the answer to the question I had been carrying so long I had almost stopped knowing it was a question. She had been the finest healer in 4 counties, and she had been alone in it, and no one had thanked her, and then he had been first. And from that first thank you came the whole architecture of what they were now. The house with the east-facing windows and the children in it, and the teaching room off the south side, and the recognition from Santa Fe, and all the healers she had trained who were right now in communities across 4 counties doing work that needed doing. And all of it rooted in that one small fundamental thing, being seen, being thanked, being known. She moved from her spot under the tree and went to sit beside Thomas, leaning into him, and he put his arm around her without looking up from watching the children, and she said quietly just for him, "I think about it sometimes. How different everything would have been." "Different how?" he said. "If you had just ridden away," she said, "like they all did." He was quiet for a moment. Alice had migrated to Harold and was now sitting on her brother's back while he lay in the grass, having apparently decided he was a comfortable hillside. "I could not have ridden away," Thomas said. "I don't think that was a possibility from the first evening." "Why?" she asked, genuinely wanting to know. He thought about it in the careful way he thought about things. "Because," he said, "I was lying in your back room in the dark, hurting in several places, and you had just told me that my shoulder would hurt for a while but I had full range of motion if I was gentle, and there was this quality in your voice when you said it, not just competence, though there was competence in it, but actual care. Like the fact that I would be okay genuinely mattered to you beyond the professional. And I thought, who is this woman?" And I wanted to know the answer. She looked at him. The sun was moving through the cottonwood branches above them. "The answer," she said, "was that I was a person who had been caring about people for 4 years without anyone caring particularly back, and I was slightly tired of it." "Are you still tired of it?" he asked. "No," she said. "Not at all, not even slightly." He pressed his lips to her temple, warm and unhurried, and she felt Harold shout something about the lizard returning and Alice's delighted response, and the river kept going and the May light kept moving, and she thought, this is it. This is the fully closed story, the one with all its threads drawn in. The healer who healed everything but her own solitude, and the man who came broken off a horse and was the first to see her whole, and the life they made from that beginning. Thomas Carson died an old man at 73, in the spring of 1921, in the house with the east-facing windows that he had built 42 years prior, with the same careful hands that had once extended toward Jennie on the land in the cottonwoods and asked to hold hers. He went quietly, which was like him, the way he had always been, steady to the end, not dramatic, not making a fuss, simply present and then gone in the natural way of things. But in October of 1884, standing in the young gold of the cottonwood trees, these things were far away. In October of 1884, Thomas Carson was 34 years old, and Jennie Carson was 32, and Harold was 4 and Alice was 1, and the ranch had 60 good head, and the clinic was full, and the surgery addition was planned, and the teaching program was a seed just planted in good ground. And on the long ride home in the afternoon light, with the mountains behind them going to copper and rose, Harold asleep in front of Thomas on the bay and Alice asleep against Jennie's chest, she thought about the word enough. How rarely she had applied it to her own life. How for so long enough had been defined solely by the work, enough patients treated, enough people healed, enough knowledge gathered. And now here was this other kind of enough. This second definition, full and warm and human, riding home through the October light with her children sleeping and her husband beside her, and all the accumulated evidence of a life being lived well in every direction she looked. She had been the finest healer in 4 counties, and no one had thanked her. And then he had. And she had the whole rest of her life to be grateful for it. The cottonwood leaves drifted down in the cold, sweet air, amber and rust, the same colors as that first October. The horses walked steadily home. The evening light was long and golden over the Pecos Valley, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything.